The laughter in the courtroom was deafening, a cruel, mocking sound that echoed off the high ceilings and walls, filling the small-town courthouse with the weight of pure humiliation. 3 officers stood near the defense table, arms crossed, their grins wide with amusement. One of them, the ringleader, stepped forward, tapping his badge as he leaned in with a smirk that reeked of arrogance. "Look at this," he chuckled, glancing at his colleagues, nudging one of them with his elbow. "She really thought she could walk in here and fool us. Thought she was somebody. But at the end of the day, she's just another one of them. Another liar, another fraud, another criminal who thought she was untouchable." The second officer laughed under his breath, shaking his head. "Yeah, we should have known. These types always think they can talk their way out of trouble. Always playing victim, always acting like the world is against them. But we know the truth, don't we?" The woman standing before them had been quiet all this time, her hands resting on the wooden table, her knuckles white from gripping the edges. Her body was stiff, tense, but her face remained unreadable. She had endured every single insult, every humiliating remark, every condescending chuckle thrown her way. From the moment she had been dragged into this courtroom, shoved into the defendant's seat like a common criminal, she had held her silence. Not because she was weak, not because she was afraid, but because she was waiting. Waiting for the right moment. The head officer leaned in closer, his breath thick with the stench of arrogance, his voice dripping with mockery. "And now? Now you're standing here, in front of all these people, and you don't even have anything to say. That's funny. You had plenty to say when we caught you, plenty to say when you were begging us to let you go. But now? Now you're just standing there, looking pathetic." Another wave of laughter erupted behind him, the sound of boots shuffling against the polished wooden floor, the rustle of uniforms as more officers just like them, sat in the back, arms folded, enjoying the show. They weren't just humiliating her, they were making a statement. They wanted everyone in that courtroom to see it, to feel it, to understand what was happening. They wanted the message to be clear: she was nothing. And yet, even as they basked in their triumph, something shifted. The air grew heavy. The laughter started to fade, like a joke that had gone on for too long, like something wasn't quite right. The woman exhaled slowly, tilting her head slightly as if she had finally decided that enough was enough. Then, in a voice so calm it cut through the tension like a razor, she spoke for the first time. "You might want to watch your tone, officers. Because in just a few minutes, I'll be the one deciding your future." Silence. The courtroom went deathly still, as if the very oxygen had been sucked from the room. The officers exchanged glances, their smirks faltering, their amusement flickering into something else, something uncertain. The officer in charge frowned, his confidence wavering for the first time. "What the hell are you talking about?" She straightened her back, rolling her shoulders, and took a step forward. The handcuffs on her wrists clicked softly as she shifted them, a subtle but deliberate movement. "I said," she continued, her voice sharper this time, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made his breath hitch, "you might want to watch your tone. Because this courtroom, this place you think belongs to you, this is my courtroom. And the only criminals standing here today are the ones laughing right now." Murmurs rippled through the room, whispers of confusion, of disbelief. The judge, who had been observing in silence, cleared his throat and exchanged a glance with the bailiff, who immediately moved to unlock her cuffs. "What the?" The lead officer's face twisted with confusion. No, this has to be some kind of joke. She was caught, she was resisting, we had probable cause." The judge lifted a hand, silencing him. "That's enough, officer. I suggest you take a seat." She rotated her wrists as the cuffs were removed, exhaling as she rubbed her skin where the metal had dug into it for too long. Then, she turned, taking slow, deliberate steps toward the bench, toward the judge's seat. And then, with the same steady, unwavering calm, she sat down. The realization hit like a thunderclap. The woman they had laughed at. The woman they had mocked, belittled, and treated like dirt. She was not a defendant. She was the judge. The officers stiffened, their postures going rigid, their laughter gone, replaced by a suffocating, sinking dread. Every single face in that room was now turned toward them, their once amused expressions morphing into shock, disgust, recognition of what had just happened. For the first time, the officers were the ones being watched. The ones being judged. And the woman who had sat through their cruelty, who had let them revel in their moment of power, was now the one holding all the control. The lead officer swallowed hard, his face paling as he glanced toward the exit, as if he were considering whether running was an option. But it was too late. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the bench, her gaze never wavering. "Now, let's discuss your charges, gentlemen." The weight of those words crushed the air from the room. The officers who had mocked her, who had humiliated her, were about to face something far worse than embarrassment. Because in just a few minutes, the real trial would begin. And what would happen next would leave everyone in that courtroom absolutely speechless. At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. This channel is a space where powerful stories are told, stories that expose injustice, celebrate resilience, and deliver the justice that reality often denies. If you've ever faced prejudice or been underestimated, know that you are seen, valued, and respected here. Get ready for an unforgettable story, one that will keep you on the edge of your seat. If you enjoy content that challenges the system and delivers shocking twists, hit that subscribe button and be part of our community. Now, let's dive into today's powerful story. The town of Millstone was small, the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where secrets were whispered behind curtains and reputations were built or destroyed over coffee shop gossip. It had the charm of a quiet, suburban dream on the surface, white picket fences, tree-lined streets, a community that prided itself on traditional values. But beneath that picturesque facade lay something far uglier. The kind of rot that festered in places where people believed the rules only applied to some and never to others. The kind of town where power was held tightly in the hands of a select few, and the law was not about justice, it was about control. For as long as she could remember, Naomi Carter had known how the world saw her. A black woman in America. Intelligent, ambitious, relentless, but to some, that wasn't enough. To some, it was a threat. She had worked harder than most, climbed every ladder with a weight on her shoulders that others didn't carry, fought against every unspoken rule designed to keep her in her place. And she had risen. Against all odds, against every obstacle thrown her way, she had risen. She had studied late into the nights while working 2 jobs, had excelled in law school while being the only black woman in most of her classes, had made her name in a world that never expected her to succeed. And yet, here she was. Standing in a cold, unforgiving courtroom, surrounded by men who thought they owned the law. The arrest had been a spectacle. It started with a traffic stop. A simple, manufactured excuse, failure to signal, something so minor it would have been laughable if it weren't so predictable. The officer who pulled her over, Deputy Mark Reeves, had that familiar smirk, the one that said he had already decided she was guilty of something before she even rolled down her window. She knew the type. Millstone was full of them. Men who wore their badges like shields, who saw authority as a weapon rather than a responsibility. License and registration, he had said, leaning against her car door with an air of exaggerated boredom. Naomi had complied, calm and collected. She had done this dance before. "Step out of the vehicle," he said next, his tone changing, sharpening like a knife. And she knew. It didn't matter who she was. It didn't matter what she had done, or, more accurately, what she hadn't done. The moment she had been pulled over, the outcome had already been decided. "What's the reason, officer?" she had asked, her voice steady. Reeves exchanged a glance with his partner, Officer Daniel Brooks, before flashing a slow, smug grin. "Suspicion of stolen property." Your vehicle matches the description of one involved in a robbery earlier today. Just a routine check. It wasn't. They both knew it wasn't. And yet, there she was, standing on the side of the road, hands against the hood of her own car while they searched it, rummaging through her belongings, making a mess of her carefully organized briefcase, their hands lingering just a little too long on things they had no right to touch. They had already made up their minds about her, already crafted their narrative before she could even open her mouth. Then came the handcuffs. Naomi had spent her entire career fighting for justice, for fairness, for the idea that the law was meant to protect, not to oppress. And yet, here she was, wrists bound, being shoved into the back seat of a patrol car like she was nothing. Like she was just another statistic. The ride to the station was suffocating. Reeves and Brooks talked about her like she wasn't even there. Bet she thinks she's real smart, Reeves muttered, chuckling under his breath. Brooks snorted. Yeah, real smart. Too bad she's still just another one of them. They booked her like they had done it 100 times before. Like she was just another name, another body moving through their system. The fingerprinting, the mugshot, the cold, indifferent process of being dehumanized piece by piece. She was held in a cell overnight, listening to the distant sound of laughter from the front desk, knowing they were talking about her, joking at her expense. Then came the courtroom. The worst part wasn't the arrest. It wasn't even the humiliation of being dragged in front of a judge for something she hadn't done. The worst part was the laughter. The casual, arrogant way the officers stood by the prosecution table, exchanging smirks like they had already won. Like they had already decided how this story would end. The lead officer, Sergeant Cole Briggs, was the worst of them. Older, grizzled, a man who had spent decades bending the law to fit his own desires. He leaned against the wooden railing, arms crossed, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. You see, Judge, he said lazily, barely concealing his amusement, we got ourselves a real interesting case here. This woman, this suspect, was found in possession of stolen property. Matches the description, caught in the act. Open and shut case, if you ask me. More laughter. Naomi's fingers curled into fists beneath the table. That's right, Brooks added, nudging Reeves with his elbow. And, you know, it's funny. She was real talkative before, had a lot to say about her rights and whatnot. But now she's quiet. Ain't that something? Naomi exhaled slowly, forcing herself to stay still. They wanted her angry. They wanted her to break, to lose control, to give them a reason to smirk even harder. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. The judge overseeing the case, Judge Samuel Harper, was a man of few words. A relic of an older time, the kind who prided himself on being tough on crime, but only when crime looked a certain way. He glanced at the officers, then at Naomi, his expression unreadable. Do you have anything to say for yourself, Ms. Carter? She could feel the eyes on her. The expectation. The assumption that she would crumble. And so she spoke. You might want to watch your tone, officers. Because in just a few minutes, I'll be the one deciding your future. Silence. Confusion flickered across their faces, quickly replaced by something else. Something uneasy. The first cracks in their certainty. Judge Harper straightened slightly, his eyes narrowing. Ms. Carter, he said slowly, the weight of realization creeping into his voice, is there something we should know? She sat up straighter. Yes, she said, her voice steady. There is. And as the air thickened with tension, as the arrogant smirks faded into something dangerously close to fear, the real game began. The room felt smaller now. Tighter. The confidence that had once radiated from the officers like an impenetrable shield was cracking, piece by piece, like glass under pressure. Naomi could see it in the way Sergeant Cole Briggs' jaw tensed, in the way his fingers tapped an uneven rhythm against the side of the wooden railing, in the way his eyes darted, not just at her, but at Judge Harper, at the silent courtroom that was no longer filled with laughter, but with something far heavier. A waiting. An unease that settled over every single person who had watched them mock her just minutes before. The arrogance was fading, giving way to something far more human, fear. Naomi let it linger. Let the silence stretch, let them sit in the weight of their own miscalculation. She had learned a long time ago that sometimes, the quiet was more powerful than words. And right now, with every second that passed, she was watching as realization dawned on them like a slow-moving storm, creeping in, unavoidable. Judge Harper's voice was the first to cut through the tension, though even he sounded different now, his usual air of authority replaced with something far more cautious. "Ms. Carter, I suggest you explain yourself immediately." Naomi didn't move at first. She let the moment breathe, let the anticipation build. Then, finally, she reached for the cuffs that had only recently been removed, running her fingers over the indentations they had left on her skin. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it now, a sharpness that hadn't been there before. "I was brought into this courtroom under false pretenses," she said, her eyes locking onto Briggs, then Reeves, then Brooks. "Detained illegally. Humiliated. Disrespected. And these men, these officers of the law, thought they could get away with it because they assumed they knew who I was. They assumed I was powerless." A scoff came from Reeves, though it was forced, brittle. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, shaking his head, but Naomi didn't even look at him. "I let you talk," she said smoothly, a quiet authority settling into her words. "Now it's my turn." The weight of those words silenced him instantly. Naomi leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering, forcing them to listen. "I wonder, Officer Briggs," she said slowly, "do you know what a judicial review is?" Briggs' mouth opened, but nothing came out. He had no idea where this was going, and for the first time, he didn't like it. Naomi let the question hang for a second before answering it herself. "It's a process where cases, procedures, and law enforcement actions are analyzed for misconduct. And do you know who has the power to initiate one?" A flicker of understanding passed through the officers' faces, but it was too late. "I do," she continued, her tone firm, unwavering. "Because I'm not just a defense attorney. I'm not just another woman you could throw into your system and forget about. I am a federal judge." The silence that followed was deafening. Naomi watched as the blood drained from Briggs' face, as Reeves stiffened, as Brooks' smirk vanished entirely. Briggs started, but his voice caught in his throat. He was grasping for control, for some kind of upper hand, but there was nothing left. Naomi tilted her head, watching them with the same kind of amusement they had once thrown at her. "What's wrong, Sergeant?" she asked, her tone deceptively light. "You were laughing a moment ago. Where did all that confidence go?" Judge Harper shifted in his seat, rubbing a hand over his mouth, eyes flicking between Naomi and the officers as if trying to process the catastrophic mistake that had just been made. "Ms. Carter, Your Honor," Naomi interrupted, her voice still perfectly controlled, but there was steel beneath it now. "Before we continue, I would like to make a formal request to have this case dismissed on the grounds of fabricated charges, racial profiling, and unlawful detainment." Brooks cursed under his breath. Briggs stepped forward, desperate now. "This is a misunderstanding," he said quickly. "You were stopped for legitimate reasons." Naomi turned her gaze on him, pinning him to the spot. "Tell me, Sergeant, what exactly did you charge me with?" Briggs hesitated. "Suspicion of stolen property," he said, his voice weaker than before. Naomi nodded. "Right. And what was the stolen property?" Another pause. Naomi's lips curved, but there was no humor in her smile. "You don't know, do you?" Brooks looked to Briggs, then to Reeves, waiting for one of them to come up with something, anything. But they had nothing. Naomi turned to Judge Harper. "Your Honor, if they cannot even state what crime I was supposed to have committed, then I think that's all we need to hear." Harper exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping against the desk. Naomi could see the hesitation in his expression, the way his mind was working, trying to determine just how deep into this mess he was willing to wade. He glanced at Briggs, at Reeves, then at the courtroom itself, the onlookers, the murmurs, the shifting atmosphere that had turned against the officers entirely. Naomi knew what was coming before he even spoke. "Case dismissed," Harper said, his voice tight. "Effective immediately." Naomi barely had time to register the words before Briggs snapped. "You have got to be kidding me," he barked, turning to the judge, then back to Naomi. This is bullshit. You can't just walk out of here like this." Naomi finally stood, pushing her chair back as she met his gaze directly. "You still don't get it, do you?" she said, her voice soft but sharp enough to cut through him. "You still think you're in control?" Briggs' breathing was heavy, his hands clenched into fists, his entire body coiled like a man whose world was slipping through his fingers. Naomi almost felt sorry for him. Almost. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "This is only the beginning." And then, with the weight of the entire courtroom watching, she turned and walked away. But the story wasn't over. Because what was waiting for Briggs, for Reeves, for Brooks, was far worse than a dismissal. They had laughed at her. They had humiliated her. And now, they were about to learn exactly what happened when you try to destroy the wrong woman. The tension in the precinct was suffocating. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a cold, sterile glow, making the walls feel even tighter, the air heavier. Sergeant Cole Briggs sat at his desk, fingers drumming against the wooden surface in a rhythmic, erratic pattern. His jaw was tight, his teeth clenched so hard that a dull ache had begun to pulse in his temples. Across from him, Reeves and Brooks stood rigid, their usual arrogance replaced with something much more uncertain. The three of them had been called in, no warning, no explanation, just a direct order to report to the captain's office. That alone had sent a ripple of unease through them. Briggs exhaled sharply, adjusting his badge out of habit, trying to ground himself. "This is nothing," he muttered under his breath, though even he didn't quite believe it. "They dismissed the case, fine. That doesn't mean anything. She just got lucky." Reeves nodded, though his usual smirk was absent. "Yeah. Lucky. But still, the way she looked at us when she left, man. It was like she knew something we didn't." Brooks shifted uncomfortably, arms crossed over his chest. "You think she's got something on us?" Briggs' fingers stilled. That was the part he couldn't shake. Naomi Carter hadn't left that courtroom like someone who had just barely escaped a nightmare. No, she had walked out in control. Like she was just getting started. Before he could say anything else, the heavy door to the captain's office swung open. "Inside. Now." The voice was sharp, authoritative. Captain Harris was a man of few words, and when he spoke, people listened. Briggs squared his shoulders, forcing himself to relax, forcing himself to believe that whatever this was, he could handle it. They had always handled it before. But the moment they stepped inside, everything changed. Sitting across from Captain Harris, legs crossed, perfectly composed, was Naomi Carter. The air in the room shifted, thick with something dangerous. Harris's expression was unreadable, but the way his fingers curled into his desk, the way his jaw was set, told Briggs that this wasn't just a meeting. This was an execution, and he, Reeves, and Brooks were the ones on the chopping block. Naomi turned slightly, her gaze sweeping over them, assessing, dissecting. Then, with slow, deliberate ease, she spoke. "Take a seat, gentlemen." Briggs' body tensed. "What the hell is this?" Harris's voice was low, measured. That wasn't a request. The silence that followed was heavy, a force of its own. Briggs hesitated for a fraction of a second before finally lowering himself into a chair. Reeves and Brooks followed, their movements stiff, uncertain. Naomi leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the table, her fingers interlocking in front of her. I assume you're wondering why you're here. Briggs' patience snapped. You've had your fun, lady. You won in court. Case dismissed. Congratulations. But if you think you can walk in here and, Naomi cut him off without raising her voice, without changing her posture. You really don't get it, do you? Reeves swallowed hard. Get what? She tilted her head slightly, studying them like they were chess pieces, like every move had already been planned. I didn't win in court, she said, her voice even, controlled. I just stopped round one. Briggs' stomach twisted. What the hell does that mean? Naomi exhaled softly, shaking her head like she almost pitied them. Almost. It means that you should have done your research before deciding to throw me into the back of your patrol car. It means that while you were busy laughing at me, while you were so sure that I was just another black woman with no power, I was already setting the pieces in motion. Harris finally spoke, his voice like gravel. She filed a federal complaint. Against all three of you. Briggs' breath hitched. That's bullshit. Harris's eyes darkened. Watch your mouth, Sergeant. Naomi's voice didn't waver. It's already in motion. An official investigation. Every stop you've ever made, every incident report you've ever filed, every false arrest, all of it is being reviewed. You see, I may have walked out of that courtroom, but I wasn't just walking away from you. I was walking towards something bigger. Brooks looked pale now, his hands gripping the edges of his chair. You can't do that. Naomi arched an eyebrow. Oh, I can. And I have. Briggs' mind raced. He knew the truth, they weren't clean. Not by a long shot. They had done this before, gotten away with it, buried the evidence, manipulated the system to work in their favor. But this wasn't just another complaint. This was a federal judge coming for their throats. We'll fight this, Briggs said, though his voice didn't carry the weight it once did. We'll, Naomi interrupted with a small, knowing smile. Fight it? You don't even know how deep this goes. She reached into her bag, pulled out a thick folder, and placed it on the table. Slowly, she slid it forward. These are testimonies, she said, her voice calm, unshaken. From people who were wrongfully detained. Falsely charged. People who, just like me, were harassed by you three. Unlike me, they didn't have the resources to fight back. But now. Now they do. Briggs' breathing turned shallow. Naomi kept going. You didn't just pick the wrong woman. You picked the wrong era. You see, the days of officers like you running unchecked. They're coming to an end. You've spent years abusing your power, thinking there'd be no consequences. But now. There are. Harris leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. You three are officially under internal investigation. Your badges, your weapons, turn them in. Effective immediately. Briggs shot up from his chair. You can't, Harris stood, voice like a gunshot. I can and I am. Reeves was shaking his head, disbelief settling in. Brooks' lips were pressed so tight together they were turning white. Naomi stood as well, smoothing the front of her blazer. I told you, she said, her eyes locked onto Briggs. This was only the beginning. The reality of it crashed down on them all at once. The laughter, the arrogance, the smirks that once decorated their faces, they were all gone now. Replaced by something else. Something raw. Something terrified. Because this wasn't just embarrassment. This was destruction. Naomi turned toward the door, her heels clicking against the tile, her confidence unshakable. But before she left, she paused. Then, with one last glance over her shoulder, she delivered the final blow. You thought you had power. But power isn't about who wears the badge. Her voice was steady, absolute. It's about who holds the pen. And with that, she walked out. The door slammed shut behind her. And in that moment, Briggs, Reeves, and Brooks knew they were finished. The precinct felt colder now. The walls that had once seemed so secure, so impenetrable, now loomed over them like a cage closing in. The weight of reality settled into the air, thick and suffocating. The three men who had spent years moving with untouchable confidence, who had worn their badges like armor, believing they were immune to consequence, now sat in the aftermath of their own downfall. The silence that filled the room was different now, no longer one of authority, but of defeat. Briggs' hands trembled as he reached for his badge, the same badge that had once given him power, control, respect, or at least the illusion of it. Now, it felt like dead weight. He gripped it tighter, as if holding onto it could somehow undo what had just happened, could somehow rewrite the past, erase the moment Naomi Carter had destroyed them. Reeves was the first to speak, though his voice lacked its usual smugness. "This can't be real." His breathing was uneven, his knuckles white as he clenched his fists. "She set us up. This is a trap. We can fight this. We can." Briggs cut him off, his voice hollow. "With what, Reeves?" His own anger was a dull, festering thing now, no longer sharp, no longer useful. "You don't get it yet, do you? This isn't a fight we can win." Brooks, who had remained eerily silent until now, finally exhaled, running a shaky hand through his hair. "She had everything," he murmured. "Every report, every complaint we thought was buried. She had names, dates, evidence." His throat bobbed as he swallowed, realization hitting him in full. "She didn't just come for us. She planned this." Briggs knew it was true. Naomi hadn't stumbled into this situation, she had built it. Every word, every moment, every second she had endured their arrogance, she had been laying the foundation for their downfall. They had walked into their own destruction blindly, so sure of their own invincibility that they had never seen the trap being set around them. A knock at the door shattered the heavy silence. It was sharp, authoritative. Then it opened. Captain Harris stepped inside, his face unreadable. But behind him stood two men in dark suits, crisp and professional, carrying the unmistakable presence of federal investigators. Briggs' stomach twisted into a knot. "Officers," Harris said, his voice clipped, businesslike, detached. "You're being placed on immediate suspension pending federal investigation into civil rights violations, falsification of evidence, and abuse of authority." Reeves shot up from his chair, his breath coming out in quick, shallow bursts. You can't just," one of the agents, a tall man with sharp eyes that missed nothing, cut him off with a single look. "We can," he said, his voice even, professional, but with absolute finality. "And we are." Briggs felt something inside him crack. "This is bullshit," he muttered, shaking his head, his grip tightening around the badge still in his palm. "I gave my life to this department. To this town. And now you're throwing us to the wolves over some technicality." His voice grew desperate, grasping at something, anything, to make this feel less real. Harris's expression darkened. "This isn't a technicality, Briggs. This is justice finally catching up to you." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Justice. For years, Briggs had been the one in control, the one who dictated how justice was handed out, who deserved it, who was denied it. And now, he was the one being judged. Naomi's voice echoed in his head. This was only the beginning. Brooks rubbed a hand down his face, his breathing uneven. "So that's it? We just, what? Get thrown out like trash?" One of the agents pulled a folder from his briefcase, flipping it open. "You're currently under investigation for a pattern of misconduct, including but not limited to false arrests, coercion, excessive force, and racial discrimination. This isn't about one incident, Officer Brooks. This is about all of them." Reeves' face twisted with anger. They're gonna take our badges over some damn reports. Over some people who probably had records already. This is insane. The agent's eyes flicked up, sharp as a blade. You still don't get it, he said simply. It's over. The word sat heavy in the air. Briggs' hands shook as he finally loosened his grip on his badge. The object that had once made him untouchable, invincible. The symbol of his authority. But now, in this moment, it was nothing more than a piece of metal. A relic of power that no longer belonged to him. Slowly, he placed it on the desk. Reeves and Brooks did the same, though their movements were stiff, reluctant, defeated. Harris nodded, his gaze lingering on them for a beat longer. You'll be escorted out of the precinct. Your service weapons will be surrendered. If you attempt to interfere with this investigation in any way, you'll be charged with obstruction of justice. Briggs felt his world crumbling. Everything he had built, the power he had wielded, the fear he had controlled, it was all slipping away. Naomi Carter hadn't just exposed them. She had erased them. And the worst part? There was nothing they could do to stop it. The agents moved forward, their presence undeniable, their authority absolute. Let's go, one of them said, gesturing toward the door. For the first time in his life, Briggs felt powerless. As he stood, as he walked through the precinct he had once ruled over, the whispers followed him. Officers who had once respected him, who had once followed his lead, now averted their eyes. Some shook their heads. Some murmured under their breath. He wasn't the king of this place anymore. He was a cautionary tale. And as they were led out of the precinct, out into the bright daylight that suddenly felt too harsh, too exposing, Briggs finally understood. Naomi Carter hadn't just won. She had rewritten the rules of power. And for the first time, it wasn't them standing on top. It was her. The precinct doors had never felt heavier, but as they swung open to the blinding daylight outside, it wasn't just the weight of the metal that pressed against Briggs' chest, it was the finality of it all. The very place that had once been his kingdom, the walls that had echoed with his voice, the halls where his presence had meant control, all of it was gone. Stripped away like it had never belonged to him in the first place. The sun was hot, too bright, too exposing. It didn't carry the comfort it once had when he'd stepped outside this building every day with the certainty that he belonged here. No, now it felt like an interrogation light, burning down on him, forcing him to feel everything he had spent years avoiding. The crowd was already there. A sea of reporters, microphones pointed forward like loaded weapons, cameras flashing in rapid succession, capturing the exact moment when the three of them, Briggs, Reeves, and Brooks, stepped out as disgraced men. Briggs' jaw locked so tight he thought his teeth might crack under the pressure. His pulse was a deafening rhythm in his ears, his breath short and uneven, but he forced himself to keep moving. He could feel Reeves close behind him, stiff as a board, his head down like he was walking into an execution. Brooks, usually the loudest, the first to crack a joke, the first to sneer at a suspect, now moved like he was wading through something thick, something suffocating. The voices hit them like a storm. Sergeant Briggs, do you have any comments on the internal investigation? Officer Reeves, multiple sources claim this is part of a larger corruption probe, can you confirm that? Officer Brooks, what do you say to the families of those wrongfully arrested under your watch? Is it true that this investigation was led by Judge Naomi Carter herself? Naomi. Briggs didn't turn his head, but he knew she was there. He could feel it. That presence, that unshakable weight that had been looming over them since the moment she had walked out of that courtroom victorious. The crowd wanted blood. This wasn't just about them being removed from duty, this was about a reckoning. The people who had been watching from the shadows for years, the ones too afraid to speak up, the ones who had always known how deep the corruption ran but had never seen any justice, they were watching now. And they weren't just watching for a headline. They were watching because they had been waiting for this moment. Briggs could hear Reeves' breath quicken beside him, a low muttering under his breath that sounded like half-formed curses, half-baked denials. Brooks' hands were shoved deep into his pockets, his shoulders hunched like he was bracing for a hit. But the worst part? The part that made Briggs' stomach twist into a tight knot, so tight it felt like he might never breathe right again. No one in the department was stopping this. No one was stepping in to shield them. No familiar voices were cutting through the reporters, telling them to back off, calling for space, calling for respect. Because they didn't deserve respect anymore. And maybe they never had. The reality of it settled into Briggs' chest like cement. His feet felt heavy, dragging against the pavement, each step pulling him deeper into something he had spent years pretending would never come. He had known men like him in the past, men who had fallen from grace, and he had always told himself they were different. That he was different. But now he knew the truth. He wasn't different. He was just another bad cop getting exactly what he deserved. A sharp voice cut through the chaos, loud enough to pierce through the noise, clear enough that it sent a chill down his spine. What do you have to say to the people whose lives you destroyed? Briggs stopped walking. For the first time, he stopped walking. The words hit him in a way nothing else had, not the suspension, not the loss of his badge, not even Naomi's cold, calculated dismantling of everything he had built. Because those words, the people whose lives you destroyed, weren't just an attack. They were the truth. He didn't have an answer. He had spent his career avoiding that question. He had spent years pretending it wasn't his concern, convincing himself that power was the only thing that mattered. That control meant righteousness. That if he didn't look back, if he never thought about the people left behind, the ones who had cried for justice, then it meant he didn't have to feel the weight of them. But the weight was here now. And it was crushing. Reeves stepped forward, his face twisted with anger, panic, something desperate. "This is a setup," he snapped, his voice raw, hoarse from the tension that had been crawling up his throat since the moment Naomi had flipped the entire game against them. "This isn't over. We have lawyers. We have rights." The laughter that followed wasn't cruel. It wasn't mocking, the way theirs had been in that courtroom. No, this was something different. It was the sound of people who knew they had won. Naomi Carter hadn't just taken their power. She had exposed them. Stripped them down layer by layer until they had nothing left but excuses. And excuses didn't matter anymore. Briggs could feel the eyes on him, the cameras catching every twitch of his jaw, every faltering breath, every drop of sweat on his brow. The world was watching him fall. And Naomi? She was still there. Not speaking. Not moving. Just watching. And that was worse than anything else. Because she didn't have to do anything else. She had already won. And for the first time in his life, Briggs realized, this is what accountability feels like. Not a slap on the wrist. Not a paid suspension. Not silence. Real, undeniable, inescapable consequences. His hands curled into fists, his breath coming out slow, controlled, the way he used to speak to suspects when he was the one in power. But now. Now, he wasn't in power anymore. Now, he was the one being hunted. Naomi turned then, slowly, deliberately, her eyes lingering on him for just a second longer before she walked away. She didn't have to say anything. Because everything that needed to be said had already been written in history. And Briggs? Briggs would have to live with it. For the rest of his miserable life. The scorching heat outside the precinct felt suffocating, but it wasn't the temperature that made it unbearable, it was the weight of defeat pressing down on Briggs' chest, suffocating, inescapable. The doors had barely swung shut behind them, but the world beyond those walls was no longer the one they had once ruled. The air was thick with a tension so strong it felt like it could crack the pavement beneath their feet. The three of them, Briggs, Reeves, and Brooks, stood frozen, their bodies tense, their breath uneven. Each step forward felt like stepping into a battlefield where they were already losing. The sea of reporters stretched in front of them like an unrelenting force, cameras raised, microphones extended, voices loud, overlapping, attacking from every angle. The sheer ferocity of the moment was suffocating, a sharp contrast to the way they had walked into this building so many times before, untouched, unbothered, untouchable. But now, they were standing on the opposite end of power, no longer protected by the very system they had used to shield themselves. Sergeant Briggs. Do you have any response to the allegations against you? Officer Reeves, how do you respond to claims that this is just the beginning of a larger corruption probe? Officer Brooks, do you have anything to say to the people who were wrongfully arrested under your watch? Reports indicate Judge Naomi Carter was personally involved in the investigation. Do you believe this was personal retribution? Naomi Carter. The name alone sent a cold, sharp wave through Briggs' body, making his fingers twitch at his sides. He didn't need to look to know she was there. He could feel it. That presence, that unshakable, relentless force that had been suffocating them since the moment she stepped into that courtroom and turned their world upside down. The reporters were relentless. They weren't just after quotes. They weren't just looking for another headline. No, they were here to witness the fall of men who had spent their entire lives believing they could never fall. Briggs could feel Reeves growing more restless beside him, his breathing growing faster, uneven, his nerves unraveling. This isn't happening, he muttered under his breath, but the words lacked conviction. This can't be real. We're cops, for God's sake. They don't do this to us. The bitterness in his voice made it clear that, for the first time, he was realizing the truth. Brooks exhaled sharply, his hands shoved into his pockets, his shoulders hunched like he was trying to make himself smaller, trying to disappear inside himself. His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke, his tone barely above a whisper. This isn't just about us. Briggs turned to him, a sharp, irritated edge to his voice. What the hell does that mean? Brooks swallowed hard, his gaze flicking toward the watching eyes, the people who had once feared them now standing there, waiting, expecting, relishing every second of their downfall. It means she didn't just come for us, he muttered, his voice hollow. If she had enough to take us down, then she's got enough to take down more. This is just the beginning. The department's got its hands dirty, Briggs. And if we go down, we're not going down alone. The realization hit like a freight train. For a moment, the world tilted, and Briggs felt an uncomfortable tightness coil in his chest, squeezing so hard it was hard to breathe. Brooks was right. If Naomi Carter had managed to pull this off, if she had uncovered enough evidence to bury them, then she hadn't just been aiming for 3 cops. She was tearing down the entire foundation they had built their careers on. And that meant the department was next. Briggs' hands curled into fists, his nails digging into his palms, his pulse roaring in his ears. We need to talk to someone, he said, his voice barely holding on to its usual dominance. The union. A lawyer. Someone. Someone who can stop this before it goes any further. Reeves let out a sharp, bitter laugh, shaking his head like a man on the verge of losing his grip. Who the hell do you think is gonna save us, Briggs? Look around. He gestured toward the crowd, toward the faces staring back at them, toward the absence of backup from their fellow officers. No one's stepping in. No one's trying to clean this up. They're done with us. We're not protected anymore. Briggs felt something deep inside him fracture. He turned his head slightly, scanning the crowd, looking past the reporters, past the microphones, past the flashing cameras, searching for something, anything, that would prove Reeves wrong. But there was nothing. No one in the department was fighting for them. No one was coming to shield them from this storm. Because they weren't worth protecting anymore. And maybe, they never had been. The realization settled into his chest like a lead weight, thick, heavy, suffocating. For years, they had walked these streets without fear, had ruled over this town with the certainty that nothing could touch them. That no matter how bad things got, no matter how many reports were filed, no matter how many voices tried to rise up against them, they would always be untouchable. But Naomi Carter had done something they had never expected. She had rewritten the rules. And now, they were the ones being judged. Reeves let out another harsh breath, rubbing a hand down his face, his skin pale, his expression tightening with something Briggs had never seen before. Real fear. "This is bad," he muttered, his voice barely above a breath. "This is real bad." Briggs didn't respond. He couldn't. Because for the first time, he didn't have a way out. And the worst part? Naomi Carter wasn't gloating. She wasn't standing in front of them mocking their downfall, wasn't delivering some final parting speech about how they had brought this upon themselves. She wasn't doing anything at all. She was just watching. And somehow, that was worse. Because it meant that she didn't need to say anything. The work was already done. The moment had already passed. And now, they were the ones left standing in the wreckage. Briggs felt the weight of the silence, of the judgment, of the consequences wrapping around him like a slow-moving noose. His badge was gone. His power was gone. And in the eyes of the people who had once feared him, who had once stepped aside when he walked through the streets, he was no longer a man of authority. He was just another disgrace. Naomi turned then, slow, deliberate, not sparing them another word. Because she didn't need to. She had already won. And for the first time in his life, Briggs realized what true accountability felt like. It wasn't a slap on the wrist. It wasn't a paid suspension. It wasn't silence. It was this. A public fall from grace, an undoing so absolute that there was no crawling out of it. And Briggs? Briggs knew, in the deepest part of his soul, that this was just the beginning of the reckoning that was coming for them all. The silence that followed was unlike anything Briggs had ever known. Not the silence of an interrogation room, where he had once controlled the air, the narrative, the very breath of the person sitting across from him. Not the silence of a courtroom, where his testimony had carried weight, where his uniform had demanded respect, where his voice alone could decide the fate of another person. No, this was a different kind of silence. The kind that didn't just hang in the air, it suffocated. The kind that stretched out in every direction, swallowing him whole. Because there was nothing left to say. The reporters had stopped shouting questions. The voices that had once blended into an indistinct, chaotic mass had now settled into something calmer, something more final. They had gotten what they came for. They had their images, their footage, their confirmation that the great Sergeant Briggs, the untouchable cop who had spent years treating this town like his own personal hunting ground, was now nothing more than a disgraced man in the wreckage of his own making. Reeves and Brooks stood beside him, but they may as well have been miles away. They were drowning just as much as he was, each lost in their own versions of this slow-burning collapse. Their hands had been forced, their power stripped, and yet, even now, Briggs could feel the denial still clawing at the edges of his mind. This can't be happening. This can't be real. This can't be how it ends. But it was. Because Naomi Carter had made sure of it. Briggs turned his head just slightly, just enough to see her, standing there on the other side of the chaos, watching. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't even speaking. She was simply witnessing, watching him fall, watching the empire he had built crumble around him, watching the weight of his own sins finally drag him under. And somehow, that was worse than anything she could have said. Because it meant that she didn't need to say anything. She had already won. Reeves let out a sharp breath, his voice low and bitter. "This is bullshit," he muttered under his breath, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles were turning white. "This is a goddamn setup. She planned this, she's been waiting for this, she wanted this to happen." Briggs' jaw tightened. "Shut up, Reeves." But Reeves was unraveling fast, his entire body vibrating with fury, his voice growing sharper, more desperate. "No, you shut up, Briggs. You act like we're just supposed to roll over and accept this. Like we're supposed to let this happen. He took a step closer, his breath hot with anger. You think they're just gonna stop here? You think Carter is done with us? No, man, she's gonna bury us. She's gonna drag us through every court she can find, she's gonna dig up every single thing we ever did, and when she's done with us, she's gonna move on to the next guy, and then the next, until we're just another footnote in a goddamn history book about corruption. Brooks exhaled shakily, shaking his head. Maybe she should. The words hit like a hammer. Reeves' head snapped toward him, his face twisted with something between betrayal and disbelief. What did you just say? Brooks' shoulders slumped, his face pale, his hands gripping the edge of his belt like he was holding himself together. Maybe she should, man. Maybe it's about damn time someone did. He lifted his gaze, looking between Briggs and Reeves, his voice raw, exhausted. We thought we could do whatever we wanted. That nobody could touch us. That the badge meant power, meant we decided who mattered and who didn't. But now we're on the other side of it, and you don't like it, do you? He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head again. You don't like the feeling of being judged. Of being powerless. Of knowing that no matter what you say, no one's gonna listen, because they've already decided who you are. His voice cracked slightly, and for the first time, guilt seeped into his words. Well, welcome to their world. Briggs felt something inside him snap, but it wasn't anger. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even shock. It was something worse, something he wasn't ready to name. Because Brooks was right. For the first time, he was standing on the other side. The side where people didn't believe you when you said you were innocent. The side where your past was used against you before you even had a chance to speak. The side where no one cared about your excuses, your justifications, your reasons. And it was miserable. He had never thought about it before. Never cared to think about it before. He had watched people break under the same system he had upheld, had seen their faces, their eyes, the way their shoulders slumped when they realized that no one was going to listen to them, no one was going to save them, that they were just another case file in a system that never gave a damn about them. And now, he was one of them. Brooks shook his head again, muttering under his breath, running a hand over his face like he was trying to wipe away the weight of everything he was realizing in real time. I used to laugh at them, he admitted, voice hollow. When they begged. When they cried. When they said they didn't do it. I used to think it didn't matter. That they were guilty anyway. That they'd just figure out how to deal with it, the same way everyone else did. His voice broke, just slightly, and Briggs felt the shift in the air like a change in the wind before a storm. But now I get it. I finally get it. Reeves scoffed, shaking his head. You're losing it, man. But Brooks wasn't listening anymore. He was staring at Naomi now, at the way she still wasn't saying a damn word, at the way her presence alone was enough to unravel them completely. She didn't have to fight for this, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. She didn't have to scream or beg or demand that people believe her. She didn't have to do any of that. Because she already knew. She knew that when the truth finally came out, it would speak for itself. Briggs felt the nausea rise in his throat, hot and suffocating. Because that was the worst part, wasn't it? Naomi Carter hadn't won by playing dirty. She hadn't lied, she hadn't fabricated evidence, she hadn't tricked them into confessing to something they didn't do. She had simply let the truth come to light. And that alone had been enough to destroy them. Briggs inhaled deeply, forcing himself to look away, forcing himself to push down the sharp, burning realization that was settling into his gut like poison. Because if the truth alone had been enough to ruin them, then what did that say about who they had been all along? Naomi Carter sat in her office, the dim glow of the city lights casting long shadows across the polished wood of her desk. The weight of the past few weeks had settled into her bones, but it wasn't exhaustion that filled her now, it was something deeper, something satisfying. Justice had finally caught up to the men who had spent their lives believing they were above it, and as much as they had fought, as much as they had resisted, the truth had buried them beneath its unrelenting force. She glanced at the documents spread before her, reports detailing the final steps of the investigations, court proceedings, official resignations, and pending sentences. Briggs, Reeves, Brooks. Their names were no longer spoken with the authority they had once wielded. They had been stripped of everything, their badges, their power, the shield they had used to justify every abuse, every lie, every act of cruelty. Their downfall had been public, undeniable, permanent. Briggs had been the first to go. His arrogance had carried him far, but it had also been his undoing. When the charges were filed, he had fought back viciously, believing that if he just pushed hard enough, he could make it all disappear. But Naomi had been relentless, and the evidence against him was too much to ignore. The recordings, the falsified reports, the witness testimonies, it had all been painstakingly collected, laid out for the world to see. There had been no room for doubt, no way for him to twist the narrative in his favor. His attempts to fight the system that had once protected him only led to more exposure, more disgrace. When the verdict was read, guilty on multiple counts of misconduct, falsification of evidence, and obstruction of justice, he had sat in silence, his once commanding presence reduced to nothing. And now, he was facing years behind bars, stripped of the very authority he had spent his life abusing. Reeves had fared no better. Unlike Briggs, he had crumbled under the pressure, his bravado shattering the moment he realized that there would be no escape. He had been desperate, trying to cut deals, trying to shift blame, but it had all been in vain. The system had turned against him in the same ruthless way he had once turned against others. He had pleaded, had tried to paint himself as a victim, but the public had seen through him. The courtroom had been packed when his sentencing was announced, and Naomi had been there, standing tall, unwavering, as the reality of his fate settled onto his shoulders. The same cold metal handcuffs he had placed on so many innocent people were now locked around his wrists. Brooks had been the only one who had seen it coming before it was too late. Maybe it had been guilt, maybe it had been self-preservation, but when he had finally broken down and admitted to what they had done, it had sealed their fate. His cooperation had earned him a lighter sentence, but it hadn't saved him from falling. The damage had been done, and no amount of regret could erase the past. He had been forced to stand before the families, the people he had wronged, and face them without the shield of his uniform. And there had been no sympathy for him, no forgiveness, only the cold reality of consequence. And Naomi? She had walked away victorious, not just in the courtroom, not just in the legal system, but in the court of public opinion. The case had made national headlines, sparking larger investigations, bringing long overdue scrutiny to the corruption that had been allowed to thrive for far too long. She had become a symbol, not just of justice, but of accountability, of the power that came when the truth was no longer ignored. People who had once felt voiceless had begun to speak. Cases that had been forgotten were now being reopened. The city, the country, had been forced to look at itself, to see the cracks in the system, the people it had failed, and to finally ask, how many more Briggs, Reeves, and Brooks were still out there? She took a deep breath, letting the satisfaction settle over her. This fight was never just about her. It was never about revenge. It was about change. It was about making sure that the next time someone like her was dragged into a courtroom in handcuffs, they wouldn't have to fight alone. That they wouldn't have to prove their worth against a system that had already decided against them. She stood up, stepping toward the window, looking out over the city that had once tried to break her. But she hadn't been broken. She had won. And justice? Justice had finally prevailed. And now, I want to ask you, the listener, what did you feel when you heard this story? Did you feel the frustration of injustice? Did you feel the weight of a system that had failed too many times before? Or did you feel the satisfaction of seeing the powerful finally answer for their actions? Because this isn't just a story. This is a reflection of reality. This happens every day. But the difference is, sometimes, justice doesn't come. Sometimes, the truth is buried. Sometimes, the guilty walk free while the innocent suffer. But what if we didn't accept that? What if we demanded more? What if we held power accountable the way Naomi Carter did? Because the truth is, power only exists when people let it exist unchecked. But when people fight back, when they refuse to be silenced, that's when real change happens. So tell me, what would you do if this was your story? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Let's start a conversation. And if you want more stories like this, more tales of justice, of retribution, of shocking twists that turn power on its head, then make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. Because the truth always finds its way out.